The wind had a voice that day, low and slow, carrying the smell of mesquite and the faint rattle of dry grass. Out where the desert stretched wide as forever, a single rider moved along a fence line half buried in sand. His name was Eli Harper, though few called him that anymore. Most folks just said Old Harper or the man at Dry Creek. He was a tall shadow on a tired horse named Dusty, their pace the same steady rhythm it had been for 20 years. The saddle creaked softly. His hat brim drooped like wilted canvas. The rifle in his scabbard was older than some of the towns downriver, and the lines on his face were cut deep, carved by sun, wind, and time more than by worry. The world had changed, but Eli hadn't. The railroad had pushed across the plains, bringing merchants, telegraphs, and shiny men with soft hands. Cattle were branded by companies now, not cow hands. The saloons were gone or turned into general stores. Folks called it progress, but to Eli Harper it just felt like noise. He still rose with the first light, boiled coffee black as midnight, poured it into a chipped tin cup and sat by his porch watching the desert breathe. He spoke to no one. Sometimes to Dusty, sometimes to the land itself. "Mornin', old friend," he'd say, tipping his hat to the horizon. "Still here, ain't we?" And the land always answered, not with words, but with the sound of wind brushing over sagebrush, the hum of a lonely coyote far away, and the crack of heat splitting rocks in the noon sun. That morning, as he rode along the north fence, Eli noticed a strand of barbed wire pulled clean loose from its post. A tumbleweed had caught it and dragged it half a mile. He muttered to himself and dismounted, his knees cracking like gunfire when his boots hit the dirt. He worked the wire with bare, scarred hands, looping and twisting until it sang tight again. That's when he heard it. A short, sharp cry. Not human. Not quite an animal either. He froze, listening. Another sound followed, a desperate snort and the clatter of hooves striking metal. Eli straightened, shading his eyes against the white sun. 50 yards down the fence line, something struggled. A Mustang, wild and dark, tangled deep in barbed wire. Its muscles rippled under a coat of dust and blood, eyes wide with panic. "Easy now," Eli murmured, stepping slow. Dusty whinnied behind him, uneasy, but Eli kept his voice calm, the way a man does when he's spent a lifetime around frightened things. "Ain't no harm meant, boy. Let's get you free." The Mustang lunged, barbed wire cutting deeper into its flank. Eli winced. He pulled his gloves from his saddlebag, cut through the wire with old nippers, and whispered the whole time, not to soothe the horse so much as to steady himself. When the last strand gave way, the animal stumbled back, trembling. It didn't bolt. It just stood there breathing hard, blood streaking its side. That's when Eli saw the brand burned into its flank, a crooked R with a bar underneath it. He froze. That mark hadn't been seen in these parts for near 40 years. It was the Red Rock Outfit brand, the mark of rustlers, thieves, and killers who'd once roamed this land like ghosts. And once, long ago, Eli Harper had ridden with them. For a long minute, he just stared at the mark, the wind tugging at his coat. Then he spat in the dirt and muttered, "Didn't think I'd see that curse again." The Mustang staggered off toward the creek bed, leaving drops of blood like a trail of red dust. Eli watched it vanish between the rocks. The brand burned into his mind. That night he couldn't sleep. The desert air turned cold, the kind of cold that made wood creak and stars burn sharp as nails. Eli sat by his fire, coffee steaming in his cup, staring into the flames. He thought of the old days, when he was young and mean, riding with men who lived by the gun and died by it too. They'd called themselves free, but they were just chained to greed. He'd left them after the Travis Canyon massacre, when a job gone bad left 2 ranchers dead and a house in ashes. Eli had walked away that day and never looked back. But now, that brand was back, and that meant somebody was stirring up ghosts best left buried. He reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a small weathered box. Inside was an old revolver, its handle worn smooth. The barrel still shined faintly in the firelight. It was his old Colt .45, the one he hadn't fired in 15 years. He turned it over in his hands, thumb brushing the engraving along the grip. To Eli, for riding true. He remembered who gave it to him. Ben Travis, the rancher whose life he'd saved in the massacre. The same man whose land lay just south of his own, near Coyote Mesa. Ben had been the last real friend he'd had. Eli holstered the Colt slowly. Dusty lifted his head, sensing something in the air. "Don't look at me like that," Eli said softly. "Ain't saying I'm going hunting. Just thinking." But deep down he knew. The desert didn't send him that Mustang for no reason. It was a sign, or maybe a warning. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He loaded his rifle, packed coffee, jerky, and a coil of rope. The sun rose red over the hills, and the wind whispered like an old friend saying goodbye. He saddled Dusty and swung up into the stirrups with a grunt. His shadow stretched long across the sand. As he turned south toward Coyote Mesa, he looked back once at his cabin. Small, silent, a piece of the past, holding on by willpower alone. "Keep watch, old place," he said under his breath. "Might be gone a spell." Then he nudged Dusty forward, and the two of them rode out into the empty land, toward a horizon painted in gold and memory. Behind him, the desert held its breath. The sun rose hard and bright over the mesa, carving shadows deep into the stone. By the time Eli Harper reached the dry ridge above Coyote Creek, the day had already burned most of the cool out of the morning. Dusty's hooves clicked against the old trail, stirring small clouds that hung behind them like smoke. Eli leaned low in the saddle, eyes narrowing. The tracks he followed were faint, but years of cattle work had taught him to read the land like scripture. 4, maybe 5 horses, 2 shod, 3 not. They'd passed less than 2 days ago, heading south by the rocks where the creek twisted dry. He slid off his horse and knelt, brushing a hand across the print. The dirt was soft, still holding shape. "They ain't ghosts, Dusty," he murmured. "They're real, and they're close." The wind sighed through the sagebrush, bringing with it the faint smell of smoke. By noon, he reached the Travis ranch. Though the sign over the gate had half fallen, letters bleached to bone, Ben Travis's place had once been proud. White fencing, a big barn, and cattle that grazed across miles of open field. Now it looked tired. The fences sagged, the barn door swung loose, and the only sound was the wind rattling tin. Eli dismounted slow, his boots crunching gravel as he walked to the porch. The rocking chair was still there. Ben had carved it himself years back. Eli's chest tightened a little, seeing it empty. He knocked once on the door. No answer. When he pushed it open, the smell hit him. Old coffee, stale smoke, and the faint bite of gun oil. Inside, dust lay thick on the furniture. A rifle leaned against the wall, and on the table sat a half-burnt letter, edges singed black. Eli picked it up, squinting to read the faded ink. "Ben, they're back. Red Rock boys. Came through 2 nights ago looking for men, cattle, anything they can take. Said they're riding under your old partner's mark. I'm heading to warn the others. If you see Harper, tell him to watch the ridges." Eli folded the paper carefully and slid it into his vest. His jaw tightened. "Old partner's mark," he muttered. "Guess they mean me." He moved through the rest of the house slow, checking corners like a man walking through memory. No sign of Ben, no fresh food, no horses in the stable, just emptiness. As he stepped out, Dusty stamped the ground nervously. Eli followed the horse's gaze, toward the far pasture where a single steer lay dead. Around it, boot prints and hoof marks tore up the dirt. The animal had been branded over. The same crooked R he'd seen on the Mustang. The past wasn't creeping back anymore. It was galloping. That night, Eli camped near the ridge above Red Hollow, where the land broke into canyons and gullies sharp as scars. He built a small fire, enough to keep the chill off but not enough to draw eyes. He sat with his coffee, staring into the flames like they held answers. He hadn't thought of Red Rock outfit in years. Not since that night in Travis Canyon. Back then, they were a pack of hard men living by a harder creed. Take what you can, leave what you must. He joined them out of hunger, not hate. A young cowboy with nothing but a saddle and an empty stomach. But greed had a way of making men cruel, and when the Travis job turned into murder, Eli's soul soured for good. He'd walked away, never picked up the gun again. Until now. He looked down at his Colt .45 gleaming faintly in the firelight. "Never thought I'd need you again," he said quietly. "Guess the West ain't done with me yet." The coyotes howled in the distance. The fire popped. Eli leaned back against his saddle, letting sleep take him slow. At dawn, he was already riding again. The trail wound through stone canyons where echoes carried like whispers. In one spot, he found fresh signs. Ashes from a small fire, a tin can still warm to the touch. He knelt, listening. Then he heard it. Voices. Faint. 2, maybe 3, drifting down from the ridge ahead. Eli moved off the trail, leading Dusty by the reins through a dry wash. He crouched behind a rock outcropping and looked up. 3 riders sat around a campfire laughing low. Their horses were thin, wild-eyed. One man was sharpening a knife, another cleaning a rifle. And the third, the youngest, was carving something into a stick with a bowie knife. Eli's eyes narrowed. The brand on their horses was fresh, the crooked R with the bar. He didn't draw his gun. Not yet. He just watched, listened. "Boss says we ride by Travis's again tonight," one of them said. "Didn't we clean that place out already?" "Yeah, but word is the old man's got a friend sniffing around. Some rancher from Dry Creek," the youngest one chuckled. "Dry Creek? Ain't no one out there but dust and ghosts." Eli's jaw set. He eased back, careful not to dislodge any rocks. Then, silent as a shadow, he mounted up and turned Dusty back down the wash. There was no doubt now. Red Rock was back. Not the same men, but the same disease, greed, lawlessness, and the smell of smoke in the wind. He'd been part of it once. He wouldn't let it poison the land again. By late afternoon, he reached the rim of Coyote Hollow, a place where the land dipped into a bowl of rock and sand. From up top, he saw the rustlers' main camp. 6 tents, a corral full of stolen cattle, and men moving about like ants. One of them stood apart, tall and broad, wearing a black duster. When the man turned, sunlight caught on something at his hip, a revolver with a silver inlay. Eli's heart stopped. It was his old gun, the one he'd lost 40 years ago in Travis Canyon. The same engraved handle, to Eli for riding true. He swallowed hard. "So that's how it is," he muttered. He watched until the sun dipped low, painting the canyon gold and crimson. Then he turned away, pulling his hat brim low. The time for watching was over. The time for ghosts was done. Tomorrow he'd ride down there. Tomorrow Eli Harper was going to meet the men who wore his brand. The dawn came slow, bleeding across the horizon like fire spreading through dry grass. Eli Harper sat his horse on the ridge above Coyote Hollow, staring down into the bowl of red rock below. The campfire smoke drifted thin and gray, curling into the morning sky. He could see them moving, 6 men, maybe 7, tending cattle and oiling rifles. From this distance, they looked small, but Eli knew what kind of trouble small things could bring. A spark was all it took to set a whole prairie ablaze. He checked his rifle, ran a cloth along the barrel, then holstered the Colt on his hip. His hands moved slow and certain, no tremor, no hesitation. He'd done this kind of thing long before most of those boys were born. Dusty snorted quietly, shifting beneath him. Eli leaned forward and rubbed the horse's neck. "Easy now," he whispered. "Ain't looking for blood, just the truth." He started down the slope, weaving between rocks, letting the morning wind cover his sound. The canyon walls rose on both sides, sandstone streaked with iron and old shadows. It smelled of dust and smoke, and somewhere far off, the faint cry of a hawk echoed like a warning. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the camp had begun to stir. Eli slid off Dusty, looped the reins around a boulder, and walked forward, rifle low but ready. He didn't bother to hide. A sentry spotted him first, a thin kid with a patchy beard and eyes too young for the life he'd chosen. "Hey," the boy shouted, fumbling for his gun. "Who the hell are you?" Eli kept walking, boots crunching slow against the sand. "Name's Harper," he said evenly. Eli Harper. That name carried weight, though the kid didn't recognize it. But one of the older men did. He froze halfway through lighting a smoke and muttered, "Harper? That can't be." The tall man in the black duster turned then. He stepped out from his tent, sun glinting off the silver revolver on his hip. Eli's revolver. "Well, I'll be," the man said, voice low and rough. "Didn't think ghosts rode horses." Eli stopped 10 paces away. "Seems I ain't the only one come back from the dead." The man grinned, a slow, cold grin that didn't reach his eyes. Name's Rafe Cutter. Used to ride with a man called Harper, or so the stories go. Heard he ran out on Red Rock the night Travis burned. Eli's jaw clenched. You talk too much for a thief, Rafe chuckled. And you're too old to be playing lawman. I took this piece off a dead rustler down in the valley. Didn't know it had a name to it. Guess it's mine now. He patted the revolver like it was a trophy. Eli's eyes stayed fixed on him. That gun's killed more fools than you can count, boy. Don't add your name to it. The younger men shifted nervously, hands near their belts. Eli could feel the tension build, like the air before a lightning strike. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then he said, You boys know what that brand you're wearing means? Rafe smirked. Means power. Means Red Rock rides again. Means death, Eli said softly. Every man that ever rode under that mark either swung from a rope or rotted in the dust. I left because I got tired of burying friends. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. One of the younger rustlers, maybe 20, freckles under the brim of his hat, looked uncertain now. Rafe, he said quietly, maybe we oughta— Shut it, Rafe snapped. His hand dropped toward his holster. Eli's eyes narrowed, shoulders loosening like a man settling into an old rhythm. Don't do it, son. But Rafe wasn't listening. His hand twitched, and that was all it took. The world snapped into motion. Eli drew and fired once, the Colt's crack echoing like thunder through the canyon. Rafe's gun flew from his hand, spinning into the dust. He staggered back, clutching his wrist and staring in disbelief. The other men froze, caught between fear and pride. Eli didn't raise his gun again. Nobody else needs to die, he said. You're just boys riding a dead man's trail. Pack up, go home, and forget the Red Rock name. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rafe laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think you can scare us off with a story, old man? He nodded toward the hills. We ain't just 6 anymore. Got more men riding in tonight. Whole valley'll know Red Rock's back. Eli's eyes hardened. Then I best make sure they don't. He turned, calm as if leaving a Sunday sermon, and walked back to Dusty. The men didn't follow. Not yet. Rafe's glare burned into his back. When Eli reached his horse, he didn't mount. He looked over the canyon walls, studying the shapes of the ridges, the narrow trails, and the high rock ledges. His mind ticked like a clock, slow, precise. He'd spent half his life mending fences and the other half breaking men who crossed them. He knew the land better than any outlaw did. And if they wanted to ride Red Rock again, he'd use the land itself to stop them. That evening, the wind changed. It came hard from the east, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of a coming storm. Eli rode the ridge lines, setting small fires at choke points, dragging brush into gullies, marking escape routes. He wasn't building traps for men. He was building a cage of the desert. The kind that swallowed noise, smoke, and regret. By dark, the first of the Red Rock riders arrived, rough men with whiskey in their blood and greed in their eyes. Eli watched them gather below like wolves around a carcass. When the first lightning bolt split the sky, the wind howled through the canyon like judgment. The fires Eli had set earlier flared with the storm's breath, spreading fast. Smoke poured through the hollow, thick and choking. The rustlers panicked, shouting, scattering through the dust. Horses screamed, hooves pounded, and the once proud Red Rock camp turned to chaos. From the high ridge, Eli sat his horse like a statue against the flames. The storm raged below, fire and rain and fury, and in the flashes of lightning he saw them running, tripping, vanishing into smoke. He didn't fire a shot. The land did the work for him. When it was over, the canyon smoldered, tents gone, the Red Rock brand buried under ash. Only a few shadows staggered out, coughing, broken, lost. Eli rode down through the smoke, eyes scanning. Among the wreckage, he found one man alive, the freckled kid from earlier lying beside a burned saddlebag. The boy looked up weakly. You did this? Eli shook his head. No, son, you did. You followed the wrong mark. He reached down, offering his canteen. The boy drank, hands trembling. Go east, Eli said. There's water and a town a day's ride from here. Don't come back. This land's done with men like us. The boy nodded, too tired to argue. Eli turned his horse and rode toward the canyon's mouth. The rain had started to fall steady now, washing away the dust, the prints, and the old sins. As he rode out, thunder rolled behind him, echoing off the rocks like the ghosts of gunfire fading away. The storm rolled off toward the east sometime before dawn. What it left behind was silence, the kind that hung heavy over the desert like a blanket. The fires in Coyote Hollow had burned out, leaving only ash and the smell of wet earth. Smoke still drifted in lazy curls clinging to the canyon walls. Eli Harper rode slow through the wreckage, Dusty's hooves sinking into blackened mud. The rain had washed the blood away, but not the memory. He'd seen too much of both in his time to believe either truly vanished. He passed what was left of the Red Rock camp. Broken saddles, burned ropes, a half-melted tin cup glinting in the gray light. The cattle had scattered, most likely halfway to the hills by now. The men who hadn't run had fallen, swallowed by their own fire. All but one. Tracks led out the far side of the canyon. One horse, galloping hard. The prints were sharp, deep, and pointed north. Rafe Cutter had lived. Eli sat there a long while, rain dripping from his hat brim. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, that maybe the fire and fear had been enough. But men like Rafe didn't quit, not while breath still rattled in their chest. He looked down at his Colt .45 resting easy on his hip. "Guess we got one more trail, old friend," he said softly. Then he nudged Dusty forward, following the prints into the gray. The trail wound through Dead Horse Gulch, a narrow stretch of land hemmed in by cliffs and thorn. The air still smelled of smoke and wet mesquite. Eli rode steady, eyes on the ground, rifle strapped across the saddle horn. Rafe's trail was fresh, bits of broken brush, hoof cuts sharp as knife marks. But Eli didn't rush. He knew how a hunted man thought. Rafe would be desperate but not stupid. Somewhere up ahead he'd try to circle back, maybe set a trap of his own. By noon the clouds broke, spilling sunlight across the desert like melted gold. The air steamed and the ground shimmered with heat. Eli paused at a ridge and raised his canteen, taking a slow drink. Dusty snorted, head low, tired but willing. "That makes two of us," Eli said, patting his neck. "Ain't much further now." He scanned the horizon and miles of scrub and red rock. Then he saw it, a faint glint halfway up the next rise. Metal-catching sun, a rifle barrel maybe, Eli smiled grimly. "There you are." He slid from the saddle, looping Dusty's reins around a patch of brush and began to climb the ridge on foot. His knees ached, his breath came short, but his steps were steady. Age had taken speed from him, not purpose. When he reached the halfway mark, a voice called out, "Stop right there, Harper." The sound echoed off the rocks. Eli froze, one hand on the Colt. Rafe Cutter stepped from behind a boulder, rifle leveled. His coat was torn, face streaked with soot. His left hand was wrapped in blood-stained cloth, the hand Eli had shot. The other gripped the rifle firm. "You burned my camp," Rafe snarled. "Killed my men." Eli's voice stayed calm. "They burned themselves, boy. You lit that fuse long before I came along." Rafe's jaw clenched. "You think that makes you better? You were Red Rock once too. You just ran when it got hot." "Maybe," Eli said. "But I learned what the heat costs." The wind picked up, whistling low through the rocks. For a long minute, they just stared at each other, two men on opposite sides of the same road, years apart but made of the same dust. Then Rafe spat into the dirt. "Ain't dying by an old man's hand." He swung his rifle up. The shot cracked, echoing through the gulch, but it wasn't Eli's. Rafe's gun fired wild, kicking his shoulder back. Eli's Colt spoke a heartbeat later, one clean thunderclap that rolled down the canyon walls. Rafe stumbled, eyes wide, and dropped to his knees. His rifle clattered on the rocks. He looked up at Eli, confusion, anger, and a strange sort of relief flickering in his gaze. "Guess you still ride true," he whispered, then fell. Eli stood there a long moment, smoke curling from his revolver. The desert wind blew soft across the ridge, lifting the last of the gunpowder into the air. He holstered the Colt slow, then knelt beside Rafe. The young man's face was still, eyes staring at nothing. Around his neck hung a silver locket dulled by dirt. Eli opened it gently. Inside was a faded photograph of two boys, maybe brothers, standing in front of a corral. He sighed, shut the locket, and set it on the man's chest. "Ain't no winners out here, son," he said quietly. "Just men too stubborn to lay down." He buried Rafe beneath a mesquite tree, piling stones over the grave until the wind couldn't scatter them. Then he stood, brushing dust from his hands, and looked out over the land. The storm clouds were gone now. The sky stretched wide and clean, the color of pale fire. In the distance, the desert shimmered like glass. Eli mounted Dusty again and turned back toward home. His joints ached, his shirt clung damp to his back, but something in his chest felt lighter, like the weight of 40 years had finally rolled off. By sunset, he reached the rise above Dry Creek Ranch. The small cabin sat just as he'd left it, quiet, half swallowed by the land. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, not from fire but from the dying light reflecting off stone. Eli swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the soft dirt. Dusty shook his mane and snorted as if glad the ride was over. "You earned your rest, old boy," Eli said, uncinching the saddle. "We both did." He led the horse to the trough, then sat himself on the porch steps. The boards creaked under his weight, same as always. He poured a bit of whiskey into a tin cup, took a slow sip, and watched the sun drop behind the hills. The desert glowed gold, then red, then violet. A hawk circled far off, its cry fading into the quiet. Eli leaned back, tipping his hat over his eyes. "All done now," he muttered. "All done." But even as he said it, he knew the West never truly ended. It just changed shape. There'd always be men like Rafe chasing old legends, always storms brewing over dry land. Maybe that's why he stayed, to be the last fence between the wild and the world that forgot it. As darkness settled, a cool wind drifted through the canyons, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Eli smiled faintly. The night was coming soft, peaceful. For once there was no smoke, no thunder, no ghosts, just the sound of the desert breathing easy again. Morning came soft over Dry Creek, the light crawling slow across the mesas like a memory trying to find its way home. The storm had cleaned everything. The rocks shone wet and red, the sky stretched wide and bright. A thin mist curled over the ground, fading as the sun climbed. Eli Harper woke to the sound of Dusty snorting outside the window. For a long moment he just lay there on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the silence. No gunfire, no thunder, no ghosts, just the tick of the old clock and the rustle of wind through dry grass. He sat up slow, every bone reminding him he'd earned his age. 68 years, half of them spent chasing outlaws, the other half trying to forget them. He'd buried more men than he cared to count, and somehow he was still here. He pulled on his boots, brewed coffee over the stove, and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of sage and dust, clean, sharp, honest. Dusty lifted his head from the trough, ears twitching. "Morning, old boy," Eli said, pouring coffee into his tin cup. "Looks like we made it through another one." He sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, and watched the desert wake. A jackrabbit darted across the plain. Hawks wheeled high above. The land was empty, but it wasn't lonely. Not anymore. For the first time in years, Eli felt peace. Real peace. The kind that didn't come from whiskey or forgetting. He'd buried his past with Rafe Cutter in the gulch. What was left now was just the wide quiet and the endless sun. He thought of the days when the West still had teeth, when every horizon held danger and promise in equal measure. He remembered the cattle drives, the poker nights, the gun smoke drifting over dusty streets. Men had been harder then, but maybe not wiser. They'd built towns out of dust and pride, and the wind had taken most of them back. Now the railroads stretched farther every year. Telegraph poles lined the valleys like bones. The sound of progress was a hum in the distance, faint but steady. Eli didn't hate it. He just knew it meant the kind of life he'd known was over. The wild had been tamed, or fenced at least. He took another sip of coffee, feeling the warmth settle deep. "Can't fence the sky, though," he murmured. "Ain't no man ever managed that." By midday, he saddled Dusty and rode out to the ridge above the ranch. The ground there was dry again. The mud hardened into cracked red lines. Below, Dry Creek wound through the valley like a lazy snake, catching sunlight on its ripples. Eli rode slow, no rush in him anymore. He stopped by a patch of wildflowers, rare this time of year, and let Dusty graze. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were a few mementos: his old sheriff's badge, tarnished near black, a pocket watch that hadn't ticked in 20 years, a folded letter never sent, and a single silver bullet, kept for no reason he could name. He turned the badge over in his hand. The engraving was worn down, but the word Marshal still caught the light. He remembered the day he'd pinned it on. Younger, cockier, believing law and justice were the same thing. Now he knew better. Law was just words, Justice was the weight a man carried when the words failed. He smiled faintly and set the badge back in the box. "You done your part," he said softly. Then he buried the box beneath a flat stone, pressing his palm to the earth. Not a grave, just a mark. A reminder that he'd been here, and that the land would remember even if people didn't. As the afternoon wore on, Eli rode north toward the high mesa. He hadn't been up there in years, not since the cattle drive stopped. The climb was rough, but Dusty handled it steady, step by step until they reached the top. From up there, the world spread out like an ocean of gold and red. The horizon ran clear to forever. Eli dismounted, stood at the edge, and let the wind hit him full in the face. It carried the scent of rain far off, maybe days away. He closed his eyes. The wind whistled low through the canyons like a song, the same old tune the desert had been playing since before men ever came. He thought of the friends he'd lost. Tom Briggs, shot over a card game. Hank Weller, trampled under his own herd. Doc Raines, who'd gone to sleep one night and never woke up. Men who'd laughed loud, fought hard, and disappeared quiet. He whispered their names into the wind one by one, letting it carry them. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had begun to fall. He climbed back on Dusty and rode down slow, the light stretching long across the valley. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky was bleeding orange and purple. The shadows of the fence posts reached all the way to the porch. He unsaddled Dusty, brushed him down, and gave him a handful of oats. "You rest easy now," he said, patting his flank. "We've done all the riding we need." Then he went inside. The fire crackled low in the stove, throwing soft light across the room. Eli sat at the table with a clean sheet of paper in front of him. He hadn't written a word in years, but something in him stirred tonight. He dipped his pen and began to write slow, careful. "To whoever finds this place after I'm gone, my name's Eli Harper. I was law once and outlaw once. I've been both the hunter and the hunted. I've buried more men than I should have and outlived more than I deserved to. The land don't owe me nothing, and I reckon I don't owe it either. If you're reading this, take care of the place. Don't fence too much, don't dig too deep. Let the desert breathe. It's older than any of us, and it'll outlast all our names. Ride honest. Shoot straight. Leave room for the sky. E.H." He folded the note, placed it on the table, and set his old hat on top of it. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded. The stars came out one by one, bright, endless, and close enough to feel. Eli poured the last of his whiskey into the cup and carried it out to the porch. He sat down, leaned back, and looked out over the land one more time. The wind was soft tonight, the kind that whispered instead of howled, the kind that carried peace. He took a slow sip, let it burn gentle, then smiled. "Good night, West," he said. "You done me fair." The desert answered with silence, not empty, but full. As the stars thickened and the coyotes began their far-off song, Eli Harper closed his eyes, hat tipped low, a faint smile still on his lips. The old cowboy had finally come home.